And share screen. Okay, welcome everybody. Kertov. Here it's 9 o'clock in the morning. So last week I started with the issue of the question: is there a mitzvah to believe in God? Start a little bit higher up here. It is. Is there a religious commandment to believe in God? I actually wrote an article about it. Um, you can find it on when you look under my name, Raphael Shuchat, at academia.edu. You can find it there if you look for it. This article I published in a journal from the University of Krakow in English. Okay. So is there a religious commandment to believe in God? Now, as I mentioned last week, this was in the Hebrew one, but at the end of the Talmud of Makot, there's a Braita of Rabbi Simlai. Here I have it in Hebrew. This one I didn't translate into English, but it's just a few lines. And Rabbi Simlai says that there are 613 commandments. The 613 commandments, I'll put it here before. 613 commandments are broken up into 248 positive commandments and 365 negative mitzvot. So there are 613 mitzvot, and they are broken up into 248 what to do, what we call positive, and 365 what not to do, which we call negative. Now, what is the definition of a commandment? The definition is, if in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, it says something in the imperative, do this or do not do that, that's a mitzvah. So if the Torah says, do not kill, so it's a negative command not to kill. If it says in the Torah to bind the tefillin to your arm, it's a positive mitzvah. If it says in the Torah not to lie, so that's a negative mitzvah. If it says in the Torah to eat matzah on Pesach, that's a positive mitzvah. Just as an example. So the 613 are broken up to 248 and 365. I also mentioned last time that the question is, how do you define a mitzvah? Because if you count all the places in the 5 books of Moses where it says do or not to do something, you'll come up with more than 613. You'll actually come up with maybe 1,000. So the question is, what do you do? What exactly is the rule of thumb? So Maimonides, in his introduction to his book of mitzvot, he creates introductions, he creates principles, what is considered part of the 613 and what is not. Some of them are obvious. If it says in the Torah in 4 places not to do work on Shabbat, that's 1. It's not 4. So it's just going over it 4 times. If it says in the Torah to keep the mitzvot in general, that's not a particular mitzvah. It's something general. If it says in the Torah you should do the right thing, Vasita yashar v'atov b'nei Hashem Elohecha, do what's right in the eyes of God, that's not a particular mitzvah. It's just a general statement. So that's Rambam in his introduction to the book of mitzvot, comes up with these ideas. But Rambam is not the first to write a book about the mitzvah. The first one was Shimon of Kiroan, and Shimon of Kiroan lives somewhere around the 8th century, if I had to look it up. And he writes a book called Halachot Dolot, the large or the great halachot. Let me look it up. A second, I'll tell you exactly when he lives. So that is the first attempt. The Halachot Gedolot is the first attempt to enumerate commandments, because we have a tradition that there's 613. The question is, how do you actually, which ones are in and which ones are out? In other words, what exactly is the 613? that we don't have in the tradition, and there are different people who tried to figure it out. The first one was Halachot Gedolot, and this is written in the 9th century. And it is, as I said, it's Rabbi Shimon of Kiruan, or Shimon Kaira, and he supposed this is an anonymous book, but this is the book. This is the author, which is usually associated with this book. There are those who think that the book was written by Udai Gaon. The more popular is that it's Shimon Kira of Kaira. Kaira, Kiruan is Tunisia. Okay, that was the first attempt. After that, Maimonides, in his book of Mitzvot in the 12th century, a book that he wrote in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, which means in Hebrew letters, is a second attempt. And after that, there are a few other attempts. Sefer Mitzvot Katzar, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, the large book of the Mitzvot, the small book of the Mitzvot, Sefer HaChinuch, which basically follows the Rambam, and a few other attempts to enumerate the Mitzvot and get to the 613. Nachmanides also, and a commentary on Maimonides called the Megillat Esther. It was actually, I forget his full name, but anyhow, so there are a few attempts to enumerate the mitzvot. Now the question is, now I have to go back to what we read last time because this is important. And this is the one piece which will be in Ivrit, but it's very important for this discussion. And I said it last time, I'll say it again this time. When Rabbi Simlai says that there are 613 commandments, which were told to Moses, and the 365 negative, which represent solar year, and 248 positive, which represent parts of the human body, which actually enumerated in the Mishnah, in Yadayim, which is a Mishnah which talks about laws of purity and impurity. So that there are 248 parts of the male body. By the way, according to our tradition, there are 252 in a female, but the Talmud talks about 248 in the male body. And there are 365 days in the solar year. I mentioned that last time. So Rav Hamnuna, who lives generations after Rabbi Simlai, maybe 2 generations at least after, he says, Ma'ikra, what is the verse that can support this idea that there's 613 commandments? Because everything has to be at least hinted in the Torah. He says the verse is Deuteronomy 33, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. The Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. It says if you take the word Torah in gematria, which means in numerical value, taf is 400. You take the word Torah. So in the Hebrew word Torah, the taf, is 400. And then you have the vav is 6. And then you have, resh is 200. No, disappeared on me somehow. Sure why. 6. Resh is 200. And the hay is 5. So altogether, that comes out to 611. So then the Talmud says, wait a second, that's only 611. So what are you saying? Talmud says, yes. But 2 of them we got directly from God. Or the 2 that we got from God, Anochi, I am the Lord your God, Lo yelecha Elohim acharim, and you shall not have other gods besides me. So only the first 2 did we hear from God. All the rest we got from Moses. How do we know that? It's actually told in the book of Devarim. The book of Devarim, chapter 5. Now, that in a moment. It's down. And this one I will, what's this? This one I'll close. Okay. Controvery Pericay. Memory, is that a good one? It's in Hebrew, I need English. Keep it. Hey. So, this one. Oh, English. Okay. That one. Oh, that doesn't work either. This one. Text. Oh. There's one where it's in Hebrew and in English, and I just can't find it. I don't know which one it is. Does anybody know? I thought it was this one, but it doesn't seem to be. Let's try this. Try this again. Bible Gateway. Oh, Bible.com. Oh, I write it like this. Very 5 to help. For the Chabad one, it's probably both. Yes. Very good. Okay, now let me open in the Zoom. Okay. This is after the Ten Commandments are said. Lord spoke these words to your entire assembly at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the opaque darkness, with a great voice that did not cease. And he inscribed them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. And when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, and the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me, all the heads of the tribes, and you said, behold, God has shown us his glory and his greatness. We heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks to man, and yet man remains alive. But why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we continue to hear the voice of God, we will die. For who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God as we lived? So, Moses, you approach, and you can hear all that God will say, and you speak to us all that God will speak to you, and we will hear and we will do. And the Lord heard the sounds of the words that you spoke to me, and God said, I have heard the sounds of the words of this people they have spoken. They have done well, and now they have spoken. However, that their hearts be like this to fear me and keep all my commandments, and might be well with them, etc. In other words, people decided they didn't want to hear God's voice anymore because they were scared. And if you look even before, either here or in Devarim, a moment, or maybe it's in Shemot. Yes. I stood between God and you at that time to tell you the words of God because you were afraid of the fire and you did not go up on the mountain. So, what we have here is the description of in Devarim that the people were afraid to listen and they ran away from Har Sinai. The Midrash says they ran away like a child runs away from school. When did this happen? When did this happen? It's easy to figure out. I think I said this last time. When you look at the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, you can tell exactly when this happened. Look, number 1 starts, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So as we said, that's in first person. If it's in first person, that means that God is speaking to the people. Number 2, you shall not have other gods in my presence. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, etc. All that's part of number 2. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, etc. And I perform loving kindness, etc. Those who love me, and the generations who love me, and those who keep my commandments. So in number 1 and number 2, God is talking in first person. As soon as you get to the third diber, third commandment, it says, "You shall not take the name of Lord your God in vain." That's in third person, which means God is not speaking anymore. It's Moses who is now the medium, the messenger, conveying God's commandments to the people of Israel. So this is what it says here. The first 2 mitzvot, Anochi and Lo Yelecha, I'm the Lord your God, and you shall not have other gods beside me. God spoke to the whole assembly of Israel. From number 3 on, it's with the Moses is the middleman and the messenger conveying the message. And that's exactly what Rabbi Simlai says. He says, 2 mitzvot we got directly from God. Anochi and Lo Yelecha. I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have other gods besides me. All the rest we got from Moses. That's called Torah, 611 we got from Moses. And all the rest, Torah we got from Moses, 611. Only 2 did we receive directly from God. Now, why is this important? Because it means that those 2, Anochi Lo Yelecha, obviously include 2 out of the 630 mitzvot. And then the question is, what are those 2? So for the enumerators of the mitzvot, we're interested in knowing what are the 613 commandments, because I guess you could argue, what does it matter? A commandment is a commandment. What does it matter how many there are? But there are those who want to find out exactly how to get to 613. So we know that 2 of them are encapsulated within the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments, Anochi and Lo Yelecha. Okay? Now there's going to be a dispute. What is encapsulated in those first 2 commandments? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. You shall not have other gods besides me. Just so you should know, the Christians understand that Anochi, I am the Lord your God, is an introduction. They don't even consider it one of the part of the 10 commandments. In our tradition, it is. Now let's read first the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot, which is right here. Maimonides, the Book of Commandments. Anybody feel like reading, or do I have to continue? Anybody still here? When people don't open up their videos, I never really know.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
We're here.
Okay, so the Book of the Commandments, Mitzvah 1. This is the 613 commandments as enumerated by Maimonides in his Book of Mitzvot, a book that he actually wrote in Judeo-Arabic. This will be important later for the discussion. Mitzvah 1, this is the commandment. The command we were commanded to believe in God, which is to believe that there is a first cause which activated all beings. As it says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And in the Talmud at the end of the tractate of Makot, they said 613 mitzvot were given to Moses at Sinai. As it says, Torah was commanded to us by Moses, meaning the numerical value of the word Torah, 611, and then they asked, well, Torah comes out to 611. What about the other 2? Therefore they answered, I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt not have any gods besides me, meaning the first 2 of the Decalogue of the 10 Commandments, we heard directly from God. From this we see that I am the Lord your God is one of the 630 commandments, and this is to believe in God, as we just explained. So, let's explain what's going on right now. According to Maimonides, this over. According to Maimonides, which is Rambam, the question is, what is I am the Lord your God? So let me do this differently. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt. Then you have number 2 is do not worship other gods. Okay? So, Maimonides for Rambam, I'm the Lord your God is the mitzvah to believe in God. Okay? And not worship other gods is a negative mitzvah. The negative mitzvah, not to worship idols or to make idols. Because it says not to worship and not to make. Okay? Oh, that seems to be quite easy. Into Rambam. So here, there's 2 mitzvot. One is a positive, one is the negative. And this makes up the 613. Therefore, they answered, I'm the Lord your God, and you shall not have any gods besides me. We heard directly from God. From this we see that I'm the Lord your God is one of the 630 commandments, meaning to believe in God as we have explained. Okay, this we did last time, but I'm going into a little bit more detail this time. Let's continue. In the beginning of the 15th century, Hasdai Crescas, who lives in Christian Spain in the north, wrote a book called Or Hashem, this book, The Divine Light. In his introduction to the book, he argues that Rambam's idea in the 12th century that I am the Lord your God is a mitzvah to believe in God, he says is illogical. And let's read it here. I read this also last week, but Begal was not here, so, and 1 or 2 others. Introduction to Or Hashem. Since the root of all the divine Torah is the belief in the existence of God, may he be blessed, as is evident, for the Torah is full of commands from the commander, and it would not be considered divine without its author, and the commander being God. Therefore, it's a mistake to enumerate belief in God as one of the commandments. For a command does not stand on its own, and it cannot be fathomed without a commander. Therefore, if we say that there's a particular command to believe in God, the commander, we are saying that belief in God comes prior to this particular command to believe in God. And if you should argue that this prerequisite belief itself is a particular mitzvah, it would require further belief in God as a prerequisite ad infinitum, which of course is absurd. Now, I'd explained this last time. I'll explain it now too. Basically, Chasdai Kreska says, why does the person do any mitzvah in the Torah? Of course, a person can do a mitzvah not because it's in the Torah. They can give tzedakah because they're just a good person and want to give tzedakah. That's true. But let's say a person wants to do a mitzvah of the Torah. So they eat matzah on Pesach because it says so in the Torah, but because they believe in God. They don't want to murder if it's because it's in the Torah, because they believe that God gave the Torah. This is an interesting question too, because you can also not murder because you just think it's an immoral thing to do. Or it could be both. But in general, if a person is doing a mitzvah from the Torah, it means that they're doing the mitzvah because they believe in God. So if you're going to say that there's a mitzvah called belief in God, that means that I'm fulfilling the mitzvah to believe in God because I already believe in God, because that's why I'm doing it. It says that's absurd. Because if I already believe in God, it's superfluous. And if I don't believe in God, then I'm not going to keep the mitzvah anyhow. I'll believe in God. So it doesn't make sense. Or let me put it in another way. It is not logical to tell somebody that there is a command to believe in the commander. Either you believe in the commander or you don't believe in the commander. Is that okay? People, that's Chastai Kresa's critique of Maimonides on the mitzvah to believe in God. Anybody understand?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. That's good. So, this is what's so Kreskas claims it is not logical that the Torah would say, that God would say, you have a mitzvah to believe in me. Either they believe in him, and then it's superfluous, or they don't believe in him, it's not going to help. One or the other. So the question is then, how do you deal with this? So Achmanides, with an N, Ramban, in his commentary, he predates Kreskas, so he was not familiar with Kreskas, but it's possible that he figured this out by himself, because you'll see the way he understands it. Nachmanides died 1270, Moshe ben Nachman, and this is in his commentary to the book of Mitzvot. His commentary to the book of the Mitzvot of the Rambam is called HaMitzvot Sheshchachan Harav Zal, the mitzvot that the rabbi forgot. Now, this is a very diplomatic way of saying, I disagree with you. Because if there are only 613 commandments, and you claim there's another one, that means you have to take away another one to get to 613. You can't just add without subtracting. So basically, it means that he disagrees on certain mitzvot with Maimonides. But that's what he called his commentary. And one of the ones that he disagrees upon is this one, the first one. Nachmanides writes, this cannot be one of the commandments, meaning belief in God. For it is the basis from which all rest are derived. Everything's derived from this. This can't be a particular command, as I've explained. Therefore, so this is not a particular command, then what about the saying of Rav Hamnuna, that 611 mitzvot be God from Moses and 2 from God, and those 2 are derived from Anochi and Lo Yelecha. They're derived from I'm the Lord your God, and you shall not worship idols. So what are the 2 mitzvot? As you just said, belief in God is not a particular mitzvah. It says, in my opinion, the Talmud said, in answering the query that the Torah is 611 in numerical value, that I am the Lord thy God, and you shall not have any gods besides me, we heard from God directly, which are supposed to encapsulate 2 mitzvot, and that there are 2 mitzvot here, says these are the 2 mitzvot. Number 1, not to make idols, including making and possessing them. And number 2, not to worship idols, as we learn from do not bow down to them. In other words, what Nachmanides is saying, if I go back to this, what Nachmanides is saying, that here there is no mitzvah. Here there are 2. Number 1, not to worship, not to make idols. Number 2, not to worship idols or other gods. Okay, so according to Nachmanides, there are 2 mitzvot here. Both of them are negative, and both of them are in the second commandment. The first one is not a mitzvah, it's an introduction. The second one is not to make idols, not to worship them. It says, Lo taselecha pesa v'chol tmuna, do not make idols or any image. And it also says, Lo tishtachaveh lehem v'lo tovdem, do not bow down to them and do not worship them. So those are 2 negative commands, and that makes up the 2 in addition to the 611 which are from Moses. Are we? So according to Nachmanides, he disagrees with Rambam that there's a positive and a negative command here. One learned from Anochi and one from Lo Yelecha. And he argues that there are two negative commands from Lo Yelecha. Do not make idols and do not worship them. I see somebody else just entered. I see Nehorai is here. Anybody else? Let's take a look. No, I think that's the same. Yeah, that's it. Okay. I continue. Again, if anything is not clear, please ask me. So I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. I do that sometimes, but not now. So, Hine. So, we read Maimonides, that there's a positive and a negative command. We read Chasdai Kreskas, who claimed that it was not logical to say there's a positive command to believe in God. And then we read Nachmanides, who also says that the belief in God is the basis of everything, and therefore the two mitzvot, which I mentioned, which are referred to by Rav Hamnuna, are two negative mitzvot in the second commandment, not to worship idols and not to make them, not to make idols, not to worship them. Okay, there's another possibility. Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, the large book of the mitzvot. This is 12th century, written in France by Jacob of Kutsi. It's actually a town, but the town itself is pronounced differently. Here's one of the Tosafists. One of Rashi's grandchildren was a Tosafist, Rabbeinu Tam. So they live in the area of Franco-Germany, what we call in Hebrew Ashkenaz. And he writes in his book of mitzvot, mitzvah number 1. And this is interesting. The mitzvah that we were commanded to believe that the God who gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, Moses, through Moses, our teacher, is the same God who took us out of Egypt. As it says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. You see what's happening here? Now, he's not familiar with Chasdai Kreskas, Jacob of Kutsi, but right away he realizes there's a problem. And right away he's trying to solve the problem. Can anybody figure out how he's trying to solve the problem? According to Jacob of Kutsi, what's the mitzvah? If it's not belief in God, then what is it? The mitzvah we were commanded to believe that the one who gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai through Moses, our teacher, is God who took us out of Egypt. As it says, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Any ideas? It does look a little confusing, but it's obvious that he's not just saying belief in God like Maimonides.
The mitzvah is to believe that the God gave us Torah on the mountain of Sinai, specifically.
But it also says he's the one who took us out of Egypt. I'll tell you the way it's usually explained, but if you have another idea, that's okay. It's usually explained like this. When he says that the mitzvah is to believe that the God who gave us the Torah takes us out of Egypt, it means that not only do we believe there's a God, but we believe that God is interested in human beings and sometimes gets involved in history. This is the God who took us out of Egypt, is a God who gets involved in human history. What we call in Hebrew hashgacha, pratit, or divine providence, which means the mitzvah is not to believe in God. That's a sine qua non. That's an assumption. But to believe that God also cares about what happens to human beings and sometimes will intervene if he feels that things are going in the wrong way, either behind the scenes or during the time of the Bible by miracles. What we call in Hebrew hashgacha pratit, or in English divine providence. That's the way it's usually understood. So it's a very particular mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah to believe in God per se. That's an assumption. But it's a mitzvah to believe that God is not just the creator of the universe, but actually is interested in human history and sometimes gets involved and sometimes watches from afar. So, for instance, he took us out of Egypt. Okay? That's Jacob of Kutsi. So it's like he's trying to solve the problem before it arises. So he's familiar with Rambam, most probably. They're about the same time. But he treats it differently. And he basically says that it's not a particular mitzvah to believe in God. That's the assumption. This is a particular mitzvah to believe that God gets involved in human affairs if he wants to, and is always watching. That's the mitzvah. Say there? So it doesn't have the same problem of the way Rambam. But the question is, Pastor Kreskas's question is a good question. So I'm going to assume that Rambam also thought about this problem. I mean, if Nachmanides figured it out, and if Jacob of Kutsi figured it out, so I'm assuming Rambam could also figure it out, that there's a logical issue here. So the question is, what did Rambam mean in his Sefer HaMitzvot when he said that there's a mitzvah to believe in God, which is a little bit problematic in the sense that it should be a pillar upon which everything stands, or a prerequisite, and not a particular mitzvah. Not only that, according to Rambam himself, it should not be a mitzvah. Let me explain why. In Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot, Book of the Commandments, Introduction, Principle 4, he has the principles, the ekronot, of what is considered a command and what not. One should not enumerate commands that relate to all the mitzvot of the Torah. So he gives one example, like the verse that says, Vasita yashar v'tov, do the right thing, or follow the commandments. However, if Rambam's claiming you should not enumerate a command that relates to all the mitzvot, well, belief in God relates to all the mitzvot. It seems to be a prerequisite. So why would Rambam enumerate belief in God if, according to his own introduction, he doesn't enumerate commands that relate to all the mitzvot? By the way, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook used to say that the reason that the Rambam does not include the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel is because it includes all the mitzvot. Because according to the Torah, the mitzvot actually are supposed to be done in the land of Israel. That's one of the commands, by the way, where there's an argument between Nachmanides and Maimonides. Nachmanides in Mitzvah 4, he says the mitzvah is to live in the land of Israel and to conquer the land of Israel and not to leave it barren. That there are three parts of the mitzvah. And Rambam is quiet about this. So the question is, even according to Rambam's introduction to Sefer Mitzvot, it would seem as if he should not enumerate belief in God as one of the 613. It's too all-encompassing. Number two, if we read Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvot, in his book, in his Mishnah Torah, right here. Mishnah Torah is his book on Halakha, it has 14 volumes. In book number 1, which is called the Book of Knowledge, Sefer Hamada, Book of Knowledge, which has a lot of introductions. But in chapter 1, he says, the foundation of all foundations is, sorry about the typo, to know that there is a first being that has brought everything else into existence. All that exists from heaven to earth, and what is in between has been brought into existence from his true existence. If one were to think of his non-existence, then there could not be anything in existence. However, if one were to consider that he alone exists, and that all other beings do not, that would not negate his being. For all beings need him, but he, blessed be he, does not need them. So, in chapter 1, number 1, Rambam says that the foundation of everything is to believe in a first being, meaning God, as a prima causa, as a first being. Then, in paragraph 6, he writes, skipped out in the middle, knowing this, that there's a first being, is a positive commandment, because it says, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And anyone who thinks that there is another God besides him transgresses a negative commandment, because it says, thou shalt not have any gods besides me, and has denied the basis, for this is a basis upon which everything else rests. So, Rambam, in his book of the mitzvot, in his book of Mishnah Torah, his book on Jewish law, Sefer Hamadah, enumerates 2 mitzvot, the same 2 mitzvot he enumerates in the book of the mitzvot, one positive and one negative. However, there's one slight difference. The way he calls it, does anybody know can anybody realize the slight difference here? What he says in the book of Madah and what we quoted before from the book of the mitzvot. There's one word different. Do 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 do. You know, I can Jeopardy that. Do 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 do. Can anybody? And he mentions this word twice. So you have to pick it out with a fine comb. One word difference from the way he describes it in his book of mitzvot from the way he describes it here. And there's also one word left out here that's in his book of mitzvot, which is not here, because he interchanged it with another word. Anybody? This could be the $1 million question. In fact, if you get it right, you might win a trip for 2 from Ramat Gan to Ramat Gan on the bus. You can see it in front of you. I'll make it a little bit larger. There's one word different between here, what he said here.
Is it about the existence?
Well, he makes it sound more philosophic here. But I mean, there's one word difference in the sense that it's significant.
That like we need him, but he doesn't need us?
Well, that's by definition. If God has, that's what we call God has absolute existence, and human beings have accidental existence, which means one day we're here, one day we're not. Same thing with the world. An absolute existence means God always has to be here. If God is the first cause, then he has to be the absolute existence. Or else the question would be, what caused the first cause? Nobody? Look again. This one.
Yes, can you show? Yes, this part, please.
You also have it in the lambda. Check again to see if I put it in. I think I did. And now let's go back to the other one again.
I don't know if this is right, but that like before it says that like, well, here it says if you believe in another God, and there it said if you don't believe in him at all. Like the difference between an additional God versus not believing in God at all.
Let me say that the difference is in the first one, in the Anochi, not in the second one, Lo Yelecha. Because remember, in the Sefer Mitzvot, he's only talking about Anochi, about I'm the Lord your God. Okay. Nobody else? Okay, then I'll point it out.
Maybe it look like more in the first part. It's more like order. Maybe different in this, but I'm not sure. The better I will not answer.
Okay, I'll help you. I'll help you. Look over here.
Yes, this is belief, and that one like order. Yes. No.
No, see, also is to believe. If you look here, this one says to know. Knowing this. In Hebrew, yedi'ah, or ladat. He says, knowing this is a positive commandment. So then the question is, this was pointed out by Rabbi Yosef Kapach, the late Rabbi Yosef Kapach, in his translation of the Sefer HaMitzvot. Here, at least in the translation of Shmuel ibn Tibon, who translated the Sefer HaMitzvot and the Guide for the Perplexed into Hebrew, he translated that this is a mitzvah that we're commanded to believe, Hamin, God. That this belief, to believe that there's a first cause. Rambam wrote his Sefer Maddah, his Mishneh Torah, in Hebrew and in Arabic. And here he uses Yedi'ah and Ladat. Ladat, to Yesh Tibari Shonah, to know that there's a first cause. And he says, knowing this, Yedi'at Davar Zeh, is a positive commandment. So, question is there a difference between knowing and believing? Secondly, there is a difference. Why would Rambam write here believe, and here he would write no? So Kapach says that the Arabic word used here is mu'atakada. Mu'atakada, in classical Arabic, means inner persuasion, to be persuaded to do something. So it actually could be translated as knowledge and not necessarily as belief. In modern Arabic, mu'atakada is belief, like Al-Qaeda, which means the believers, right? Those guys. So Al-Qaeda is the believers, from the word mu'takada. And but in classical Arabic, it actually means to be persuaded. And persuaded actually could be to know something. So according to Yosef Kapach, he says this is that he differs with Shmuel ibn Tibon in the translation. He says the Hebrew word here really should be know and not to believe, exactly the way it is in the book of Mada, in the book of Mishnah Torah. Now, then the next question is, okay, let's say in both places it is to know. What's the difference between to know and to believe, according to Maimonides? Now, this can be explained in his guide for the perplexed. Okay, I'm going to bring you two sources from Maimonides' guide for the perplexed, where we can understand that according to Maimonides, what is the difference between believing and knowing? Already from the first, you'll get the idea. When reading my present text, my present treatise, this is taken from the Guide from the Perplexed, Part 1, Chapter 50. I'm using Friedlander's translation here. Okay. When reading my present treatise, bear in mind that by faith, we do not understand merely that which is uttered by the lips, but also that which is apprehended by the soul, the conviction that the object of belief is exactly as it is apprehended. If, as regards real or supposed truths, you content yourself with giving utterance to them in words, without apprehending them or believing in them, especially if you do not seek real truth, then you have a very easy task, as in fact you will find many ignorant people professing articles of faith without connecting any idea with them. So what Rambam is saying here, there are a lot of people who profess faith and have no idea what they're talking about, because they've not tried to understand what they believe in and to try to prove to themselves that this is a logical thing to do. For Maimonides, the epitome of faith is faith of reason, what Thomas Aquinas would have called natural theology. Maimonides thought that higher than faith is knowledge. Faith means you were born into a family who believes in God, into a society that believes in God, because in the 12th century, everybody believed in God. The Christians, the Muslims, the Jews. So that was not unusual. So if you were just politically correct and you towed the line, so yeah, everybody believed. But if you would ask a person, why do they believe? They didn't really know why. Just everybody else did. So for Maimonides, knowledge means to try to transform your blind faith into something rational, to make it part of your world outlook, to try to prove it to yourself. So therefore, for Maimonides, knowledge of God is a higher level than belief in God. Belief in God is what you grow up with. Knowledge in God is an attempt to try to prove the tenets of faith to yourself by studying philosophy and metaphysics and trying to prove to yourself these ideas. So, according to Maimonides, there is actually a mitzvah which is called the knowledge of God. How do you fulfill this mitzvah? By studying Jewish philosophy, by studying general philosophy, by studying metaphysics, until you have reached some type of self-realization, if you have reached that these ideas actually make sense. Does that make any sense? So in the world that Maimonides is living in, knowledge is higher than the belief. The ultimate belief in God is the knowledge of God, which means I've proved it to myself that is the correct thing.
So only an intellectual believing in God is a mitzvah?
According to Rambam, the mitzvah is to make your emotional belief in God into an intellectual belief of God. Now, Rambam would admit that maybe you can't prove anything, but at least what you can prove, you should prove. But you cannot prove. You can prove by via negativa sometimes. But let me read this, the same idea to you also in Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, right at the end of 3. I will begin the subject of this chapter with a simile. A king is in his palace, and all his subjects are partly in the country and partly abroad. Of the former, the ones who are in the country, some have their backs towards the king's palace, and their faces in another direction. And some are desirous and zealous to go to the palace, seeking to inquire in his temple and to minister before him, but have not yet seen the face of the wall of the house. Of those who desire to go to the palace, some reach it and go around it in search of the gate. Others have passed through the gate and walk around in the antechamber, and others have succeeded in entering into the inner part of the palace and being in the same room with the king in the royal palace. But even the latter do not immediately on entering at the palace see the king or speak to him. For after entering the inner palace, another effort is required before they can stand before the king at a distance or close by, hearing his words or speaking to him. I will now explain this simile, meaning the analogy. The people who are abroad, who have no, in other words, who live in a different country and they never even heard about the king, those are people who have no religion, neither based on speculation or by tradition. Those who are in the country of the king, but have their backs towards him, are the people who possess religion, belief, and thought, hold false doctrines, which they either adopted in consequence of great mistakes or received from others, misled them. And because of these doctrines, they recede more and more from the royal palace, more than they seem to proceed. Those who desire to arrive at the palace and enter it, but have never seen it, are the mass of religious people, the multitude that observe the commandments but are ignorant of their meaning. Those who arrive at the palace but go around it are those who devote themselves exclusively to the study of the practical law, meaning halakha, and they believe traditionally in the true principles of faith and learn the practical worship of God, are not trained in philosophical treatments of the principles of law, and do not endeavor to establish the truth of their faith by proof, by intellectual proof. And those who undertake to investigate the principles of religion have come into the antechamber, and there is no doubt that these can also be divided into different grades. But those who have succeeded in finding a proof for everything that can be proved, who have a true knowledge of God so far as true knowledge can be attained, and are near the truth, wherever an approach to the truth is possible, they have reached the goal, are in the palace in which the king lives. So, according to Rambam then, the goal of blind faith is to transform it into an intellectual faith, which means anything that I can prove, I attempt to do so, in order to make it as much as possible also my own understanding and not just a tradition that I received. So, now that we found this out about Maimonides, we can now explain what happened here. When Maimonides said there's a mitzvah to know God, he didn't mean to believe in God. He meant to make the effort to study philosophy and metaphysics and what we call Jewish philosophy and try to prove to yourself these basic principles of faith as far as you can to make it part of your world understanding, your Weltanschauung, and then you have transformed your emotional faith or blind faith into intellectual faith. For him, that's a mitzvah. So according to Maimonides, there's a mitzvah to study Jewish philosophy, if that is your goal. Are you with me? So that's the way Joseph Kappas also explains it. I should maybe add to this that we don't live in the 12th century now. And from the 18th century, already both within Judaism and outside of Judaism, you have people who wonder whether all the precepts of faith can actually be proven. In fact, already the 11th century, Yudah Levi in his Kuzari claims that intellectual faith is something which can only be proven partially. There are a lot of things you can't actually prove. So Maimonides would answer that by saying, okay, you prove what you can, but at least the amount that you can prove will make your faith intellectual. And you'll know the difference between what you can prove and what you cannot. In the 18th century, it was looked at this very differently. Already in the writings, let's say, of Menachem Mendel of Chabad, in his Derech Mitzvotecha, Nachman of Breslov, in his Likutei Moharan, Nachman Breslov, for instance, talks about why was Avraham, the first believer in the first God, called an Ivri, a Hebrew? And Nachman says because Ivri in Hebrew means to cross over, la'avor. He says because faith is a leap of faith. Because there's just so much you can actually prove intellectually. In the end, you have to take an intuitive leap. That's called an Ivri. So, in Maimonides' world, for various reasons, intellectual faith was much higher than faith itself. In the world of the 18th century, of the Tzemach Tzedek and Nachman of Breslov, knowledge is actually before belief in God, because belief in God is an intuitive leap. Just want to mention that. This idea of the leap of faith is also found in existentialism in the 19th and early 20th century, Will Herber and others. Okay, Shailot, question? Anybody? Internet in general does that. People passive. Get a cup of coffee and some snacks, and then that's more or less what it does. So I taught on Zoom for like a year during Corona, but I never found it. The only good thing was I was able to record everything. So because of that, I have a large, ma'agar of these. Okay, this was basically what I want to go over today. This idea. So what happens here? This argument between Monei HaMitzvot, the enumerators of the mitzvah, and whether belief of God is a mitzvah or not, is also related on how they see the idea of belief in God. Since for Maimonides, his approach was that you have to do everything possible to make your belief in God as intellectual as possible, he thought it was a mitzvah to study these things and transform your belief into an intellectual belief. And he makes it into the first mitzvah. Others, like Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, say no, the mitzvah is to believe in divine providence. So he solves the problem in a different way. Nachmanides, he says, no, belief in God is a prerequisite. There's no particular mitzvah to believe in God. So different people, and I assume that this is the same with Chastai Kreskas, who says that this is the basis upon how everything stands. But for Maimonides, it was important for there to be a mitzvah like that, because Maimonides believes in intellectual faith. He believes that people have to be commanded to study Jewish philosophy if necessary, because that's the goal. And those who have that ability should use that ability to try to prove as much as they can to make their faith as intellectual as possible. As I said, in the 18th century already, people were looking at it a little bit different. I would say that even Tzemach Tzedek and Nachman and Breslov would not necessarily have a problem with those who want to prove what they can prove in faith. But to know that there's a certain point where you take an intuitive leap. In general, in life, it's not clear how much a human being is a homo sapiens. which means an intellectual being. It was William James, the first American psychologist, who said that human beings have a tendency to believe something, and then they use their intellect to prove that it's correct after the fact. So then you wonder, are human beings really intellectual beings, or they base themselves on something else? So the truth is, it's not just in belief in God. We use emunah in many, many things in life, which is called using your intuition. There's a book called Gut Feelings by Gert Guggeranzer. I don't know if I mentioned this or if it was in another class. And in this book, he tells a story of Ben Franklin, one of the founders of the United States. Ben Franklin had a nephew, and his nephew had met knew two women. He was wondering which one he should marry. Let's call them Susan and Jane. So he says, "Uncle, I don't know who to marry, Susan or Jane." He says, "Okay, make a list with all the pros and the cons." And whichever one of the two has the most pros and the least cons, mean the most positive, the most and the least negatives, that's the one you should marry. Okay, so the nephew makes a list of the pros and the cons of Susan and Jane. And then turns out that Jane has the most pros and the least cons. And because of that, he marries Susan. Which means in the end, the decision was intuitive and had nothing to do with the list. So, but after he made the list, he realized, no, I don't want Jane, I want Susan. So that's what happened. So there are a lot of things in life that it's not that the intellect is not something that we use. We use it all the time. But we don't always make the decision based on the intellect. Sometimes it's a gut feeling. You know, where are we now? A week ago Sunday, I was in Jerusalem at a book launch of a friend of mine from London. He was in Beit Knesset and Nasi in Jerusalem. His book is called Questioning Faith. And he was interviewed by the rabbi at the synagogue, whatever, and he tells a story that he went down to Gaza because, you have all these amutot, these NGOs who are raising money to feed soldiers, have dinner parties for soldiers in Gaza. There were quite a few of them. I know a group like that goes from Tel Aviv. So he joined one of these and had a dinner with these soldiers who were fighting Gaza just a little bit away. And so he decided he would interview some of them for his book. And he said, well, what does belief in God mean to you? So the first one said, well, God is like the basis of all human life. And the second one said, well, I feel that God protects me. And the third one said, I'll tell you a story. What's the story? The story is, I was in Gaza, and I was asked to bring supplies from one unit to another, and people from my unit accompanied me while I was driving the truck with the supplies. So I get to the second unit, take off the supplies, whatever, and then this unit leaves, and I didn't realize my unit also left, and I was all by myself with the truck. So anyhow, I try to start the truck, and it won't start. It keeps stalling, and I tried it again and again, it kept stalling. I open it up, I look underneath, I can't find the problem, get in, try to start the truck again, it doesn't go. Now time is going by, and all of a sudden I realized there's nobody around from my unit or the other unit. And I look out my window and I see some heads popping out from buildings right near me, Hamas guys. I said, I got to get out of here. This is really dangerous. So I keep trying to start the engine, it won't start. And finally I realized this could be my end. So I said, God, I'm sort of stuck here. He says, there are a lot of things I'd like to do in my life. And if you don't help me through this, I don't think I'll be able to do this, all the good things that I want to do. So if you could just get me through the next couple of moments, I'd really be appreciative of that. Says at that moment, I tried again. The motor started. I hit the gas, got out of there as quickly as I could to find my unit. And I found them eventually. That's my story of belief in God, he says to him. So Rafi Zarm, who was the guy who wrote the book, System, well, maybe it was just coincidence that at that time you were able to start the truck. You thought of that? System, what's your name? So Dr. Zarm says, my name's Rafi. What's your name? My name's also Rafi. Oh, he says. And then the soldier says, the fact that our both names are Rafi, that's coincidence. But what happened in the truck, that was a miracle. So you can't argue with somebody who feels something existentially as part of their being. You could always make the logical questioning. But the question is whether all life is just logic. You know, in the Kabbalah, we say that in philosophy, they say the highest part of the human being is logic, the intellect. In the Kabbalah, they say above chokhmah, which is wisdom, there's called the crown, keter, which is the inner being. So the inner being, meaning who am I, is beyond logic. Because I use logic, it's my intellect, it's my emotions, it's my actions. Who am I? I'm something else, which is above that. Okay, anyhow, so this whole discussion was a discussion to show that an interesting argument about whether it's a mitzvah to believe in God also can show different approaches towards the belief. That for Maimonides, it's totally intellectual. That's why for him it's very important that it's a mitzvah to know God, because that for him is to make it intellectual. For others who didn't necessarily hold this point of view, belief in God is the foundation. So why should there be a particular mitzvah? Except for, of course, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol that said there is a particular mitzvah, which is to believe that hashgacha pratit, to believe in divine providence, that God gets involved in human affairs when he wants to. Okay, dear friends, I think that's enough for today. I hope to see you next week. And I'll send you the recording of this meeting.
Before the test, is there going to be like some sort of sikum or something, or at least like, is there a syllabus maybe on the?
There is a Shelot Hanchaya. I just have to put them up in the lambda. Yes,
Okay.
and in red will be whatever we didn't cover.
Awesome. Thank
Okay.
you.
Toda rabba.
אפשר
Thank
לשאול
you.
שאלה
Bye-bye.
אישית.